We now have 238 participants here, which is a wonderful turnout for the first keynote speech. And I am very happy to introduce Professor Clark-Kazak. Introducing such an esteemed colleague like yourself is a great honor for me. With her continuous commitment in the field of forced migration and refugee studies, she's certainly influenced research debates globally and contributed to new directions. Professor Clark-Kazak is Associate Professor for Public and International Affairs at the University of Ottawa, President of the International Association for the Study of Forced Migration, ISFM, Research Associate at the Center for Refugee Studies, York University, and she was Editor-in-Chief in the, which I would like to mention explicitly, open access journal Refuge, Canada's Journal on Refugees. In the past, she's worked for York University, St. Paul University, the Canadian government, and the Coalition to Stop the Use of Child Soldiers. Moreover, she's also served as the president of the Canadian Association for Refugee and Forced Migration Studies and as director of York University Center for Refugee Studies. In recent years, her research has focused on three key areas. First, age and discrimination in migration and development policies. Second, political participation of young people in refugee situations. And third, interdisciplinary methodologies in forced migration, conflict, and development. Hence, Professor Clark-Kazak not only carries out research about forced migration, migration, and development, she also questions how to do that. As a part of that, she recently developed ethical guidelines in cooperation with scientific associations in Canada, which I don't list here. And with such work, she's not only advanced debates about ethical or research ethics and methodologies in Canada, but also generated discussions about the field globally. It is thus extremely fitting that this field, interdisciplinary methodologies and research ethics, is also at the core of her keynote entitled The Future of Forced Migration Research, Ethics and Methods in Politicized Immobility Contexts. We are absolutely delighted to welcome you to our conference, Christina. Thank you very much for sharing your ethical and methodological reflections with us. Before I hand over what I mentioned before I hand over to you, I wish to thank the conference organizers of Professor Nadia Kutscher and her team again, and especially also Christiane Fröhlich, who will moderate the keynote together with me. Christiane will collect questions of participants, and by now we are 258 people. Will collect the questions of participants during the course of your keynote, and we will then pose the questions to you afterwards. So please do feel free to hold your keynote speech. We will collect the questions and then raise them. To all the participants, please feel free to raise your questions, write down your questions in the Q&A section. As said, we will collect them separately and then raise them, or at times if there are similar questions, we'll merge them, but we'll then raise them. Without further ado, thank you very much again. Welcome. Christina, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ulrike, and also Christiane, for that warm welcome and for organizing this session. So I'm going to try to share my screen here. I hope it works. And here we go. So as Ulrike mentioned, the topic today is a fairly broad topic, and really what I'm hoping to do is to sort of set the stage and pose some questions for you and for all of us collectively as we think over these next couple of days. And it's interesting to start a conference by thinking really about methodology and ethics, because these are the first principles, but many of us, when we get to a conference, want to sort of share our findings. And so the idea today is to take a step back and to think back through, how are we producing this knowledge? How are we co-producing this knowledge? And can we do things differently? So before I start, I just want to thank the organizing team for this wonderful opportunity to present, but also for all of the work that has gone in on the background of organizing this conference. I will say I'm taking notes because I'm going to try to do something similar here in Canada, and it's quite a challenge. The second thing is I wanted to acknowledge that the University of Ottawa is situated on unceded Algonquin territory. In the context of a conference on forced migration, I think it's very important to acknowledge that Canada, the state of Canada as we now know it, was colonized and founded through the forcible displacement of Indigenous peoples. And part of that policy was a deliberate separation of children from their parents through the residential schools program. And we're in a process now of coming to terms with that past. And I acknowledge as a white settler as an indirect responsibility for that forcible removal of children from their parents. I also want to say that some of the ethical principles that I'm going to share with you today are inspired actually by Indigenous methodologies and the ways in which that researchers who are not Indigenous can work with Indigenous populations. So today I know I only have 30 minutes and I'd like to leave enough time for questions. So I'd like to frame the presentation around 4 key issues or questions. The first is what is unique about forced migration research. So many of us are coming from established disciplines in sociology, law, politics, etc. And we have our own methodologies and ways of doing things. What makes it different about doing research in a forced migration context? Secondly, given this context, what are the ethical opportunities and challenges? Third, how can we as researchers, both in and outside of academia, respond to these challenges? So I want to highlight here that I'm talking about researchers broadly speaking, not just those of us who are situated within academia, but also those of us who are working as practitioners in community settings where we're gathering information and analyzing the situation. And finally, I'd like to pose some questions to sort of open up the discussion format of where do we go from here? So first, what are the specificities of forced migration research? So obviously, I'm not going to be able to be exhaustive here, but I just want to highlight a few issues, and I'm sure many of you will be thinking of your own work and what makes it different in forced migration. So the first is, and this is where the title of the keynote comes, is this notion of forced mobility, but also forced immobility and the tension between these two. So obviously, when we're talking about forced migration situations, in the beginning at least, there is this movement. So the fact of mobility makes there's the challenges for sampling, for example, for conducting longitudinal research with people over time, but also for ethical concerns around informed consent. How can we go back to participants and make sure that they're okay with the way that they're presented in findings, for example, if they've actually moved on physically? But at the same time as we have this mobility, we also have forced immobility. And we see this more and more as the access to asylum is becoming more and more narrowly closed. So once people are forcibly displaced, they're often then forced into situations of immobility in camps, in detention centers, behind closed borders. So I give a picture here of the Canada-US border, which has been closed for many months now, which is very unusual. And obviously this also makes it difficult, if not impossible, for asylum seekers to get into Canada to make a claim. But also they are in situations of protracted irregularity, and I'm going to talk a little bit about this legal precariousness in a minute. So this forced immobility obviously poses challenges for those of us who want to get into these places, which are very much controlled, but it also begs questions around the voluntariness of consent. If people are trapped in these situations, do they feel like they can refuse to participate in a research if they're sort of captive audience, if you will? So what we can say is that when we're working in situations of migration, these are very dynamic situations, and they're a shifting politicized context. The second main reason, a difference of doing research in migration, which I've already alluded to, is the legal precarity. So we've all talked about the criminalization or criminalization of migration, so this intersection between criminal law and administrative law. But also in a context of far-reaching anti-terrorist legislation and legislation that often criminalizes refugees simply for claiming asylum. Many people also have precarious immigration and citizenship status, and this raises ethical questions around privacy. But we also need to rethink a little bit the way in which we use legal definitions as the methodological basis for our research. So often we will start with, okay, we're going to distinguish between refugees who have status, for example, and asylum seekers who don't, or we're interested in internally displaced people vis-a-vis refugees who have crossed a border. And so we can think about, are we actually reifying these legal categories by using them in our research? Another way in which migration research is different than other kinds of research is it's very highly politicized. So as many of you know, there's a long debate in forced migration studies about whether or not we should be doing research that is exclusively or at least partially policy relevant, going back to the dual imperative work by Landau and Jacobson that is very widely cited. But I think we also have a challenge in terms of being co-opted into the process. You know, the governments are often trying to justify policies, and in some cases they will use the research that we do perhaps against those policies to actually, in some cases, engage in what is called policy-based evidence making. So in other words, instead of actually using evidence to make policy, they're using the evidence to try to justify the policy retroactively. I've already mentioned this, but again, just to reiterate that we often are using discourses and categories that are politicized and have particular policy implications. This is the context in which we're working. Again, it's not necessarily specific to forced migration, but I do think forced migration, particularly in this context, where we have a lot of xenophobic and anti-racist, racist kind of discourses, that research can be used to actually reinforce these discourses. Another way in which research in forced migration is specific is that there are very clear power asymmetries. People in situations of forced migration are often extremely dependent on government services, government permissions, social services provided by NGOs, funding, and we also, as researchers, also face these similar kinds of issues. On the other hand, we have relative freedom of movement within these forced mobility and immobility contexts vis-a-vis the people with whom we work. And so I think this poses an ethical question, which we'll get into in a moment. So this is the context. Obviously, it's not exhaustive, but it gives us the context in which we are facing various different ethical opportunities and challenges, more challenges than opportunities, I would say. The first is, if we go back to the principles, the ethical principles of voluntary informed consent, for example. So people are supposed to be giving their consent to participate voluntarily, and they're supposed to have an informed opinion about whether or not they want to participate in the research. This becomes problematic when, for example, service providers are gatekeepers, so they give access to research sites, and or they're researchers themselves. So again, as I mentioned, service providers are often collecting information, both for evaluation purposes, but also to report back to their funders. And so this becomes problematic because, in fact, they need to have that information in order to report back. There's not really an essence here of voluntariness, but also they control access into a site. So researchers have to actually go through these gatekeepers often in order to get access to the populations, and therefore the populations may feel like they don't actually have a choice in refusing the research. The second issue is, in many cases, because asylum seekers and refugees and people in forced migration often have to tell their story to multiple people at multiple times. Often third parties have information of a very personal nature, and it becomes a question about who has ownership over these stories and the personal information. So to give an example from the Canadian context, we have a private sponsorship program that has been running for almost 40 years here in Canada, and this is where private individuals individuals or groups within religious institutions or other NGOs will get together and sponsor someone from overseas to come to Canada as a resettled refugee. So this is in addition to and complementary to the government-assisted refugee program. Now, the issue here is that these private groups often feel ownership over the refugees, often in a very benign way. However, in many cases, they will then share information about these, the group of people with whom they work, to other researchers, for example, to media. And so this notion of it's our refugee family, in quotation marks, means that they feel some kind of ownership over other people's stories. And this obviously has implications for informed consent. There are language and cultural barriers to understanding consent forms and processes. We'll get back to this in a moment. But also when we talk about being informed, one of the difficulties is the unpredictability of results. So one of the reasons why we do research is precisely because we don't have the information on this particular phenomenon. It's very difficult for us to predict what actually is going to come out of the research, and therefore it makes it difficult for us to really assess the risks and the benefits of participation. But more importantly also is the issue of dissemination, where in some cases the research results are presented in ways that actually undermine the safety and security of refugees. Confidentiality and privacy. So here I would like to, you can see the list of the different issues. I want to just focus in on one by giving the example of our Minister, Maria Monsef. So this is the cautionary tale where Minister Monsef at the time was Minister of Democratic Institutions, and it was found out that in fact, so she is, her platform, one of the election platforms was actually the fact that she was an Afghan refugee who came to Canada and became Afghan Canadian and now represents Canada. And so her Afghan identity was actually very important to her, both in terms of her political discourse, but also in terms of her personal identity. Now, it came to light that, in fact, she was not born in Afghanistan. She was born in Iran. And on the immigration papers, when her family immigrated to Canada, her birthplace was actually misrepresented. And so the media obviously had a heyday. So did the opposition politicians. Many people called on her to resign. She did not resign. She was sort of demoted. She's now Minister of Gender and Family. But the issue here is that people who have immigrated into a situation have precarious immigration status and or citizenship. This immigration status and or citizenship can be revoked if it is found that in fact they gave misleading or inaccurate information on their immigration forms. And I think that as researchers, we don't often think about the personal implications that can happen when we uncover information of a person's past. And so again, I think this is something that we need to take into account in migration contexts. The other thing, and again, this is not specific to migration context, but in the context of this criminalization of migration, but also the terrorist, anti-terrorist laws, it's very important to recognize that when we use online data collection and surveying, things like SurveyMonkey, Facebook, even Zoom, often the government, there can be government interception and control of this. Now, I know in Germany, there's very strong privacy laws, so perhaps it's less relevant for researchers based in Germany because your government is already sort of aware, but in many other contexts, including in Canada, we don't often appreciate the fact that many of the servers on which this data is housed are placed physically located in the United States. And this means that the United States government has automatic access to this data through the US Patriot Act. So again, I think that we need to be more conscious of the ways in which there can be ethical dilemmas, even in sort of so-called normal methodologies like online surveying. Finally, another ethical principle is sort of weighing the risks and benefits. So here in a forced migration context, I think what we need to be particularly attentive to is this sort of over-researching of highly visible or easily accessible populations and the under-researching of other groups. So here I've just given you a snapshot of the Google results as of yesterday of Syrian refugees versus Rohingya refugees. Now, obviously, this is not scientifically, methodologically sound in the sense that obviously there are more Syrian refugees versus Rohingya refugees, and you would have to do more analysis to kind of see why this is the difference. What I'm trying to illustrate here, though, is that some groups, for example, Syrian refugees, currently have a lot of research attention focused on them. They're highly visible, and in many cases, because they have been resettled to Western countries like Germany or Canada, they can be quite easily accessed by researchers. On the other hand, you have refugees like the Rohingya who are much more difficult to access, and they're less fundable in some ways because of the political and politicized issues around their particular context. And so I think as researchers, we need to think more broadly about this risk versus benefits of research, and try to think about the ways in which our research might actually exacerbate some of these global issues about attention to certain groups vis-a-vis other groups. So how can we respond to some of these ethical concerns and issues? So I'm going to give 2 examples. I'm not suggesting that these are models by any stretch of the imagination. What I'm trying to do is give you some examples of the ways in which researchers in Canada, but also globally, have thought about some of these issues. The first is the Canadian guidelines, which were developed in collaboration with the Centre for Refugee Studies, the Canadian Council for Refugees, which is an umbrella group of non-governmental organizations working with refugees in Canada, and the Canadian Association, similar to the German association of this conference. And so the context here was the arrival of approximately 40,000 Syrian refugees in 2015 to 2016, and obviously, this pales in comparison to the almost 1 million who arrived in Germany. So I'm not suggesting that this was in any way the same extent, but in Canada, at least, this was a big deal. And so there was a lot of government, media, and academic attention to this. It should also be noted that part of the resettlement was a platform of the federal government. So the government themselves were very interested in the arrival of Syrians, and also provided some funding for projects to monitor and evaluate the resettlement processes of Syrians. So in this context where many people became all of a sudden very interested in Syrian arrivals in Canada, service providers became overwhelmed with research requests, but they also had evaluation and reporting requirements. So here, what's interesting is this project actually was partially initiated by the Canadian Council for Refugees, because they felt like they didn't necessarily have the tools or the capacity to be able to evaluate the requests for research that they were being faced with, but also that they didn't have internal processes for being able to evaluate their own ethical processes. From an academic perspective, some of us were concerned that researchers who were new to the field may be unaware of some of the ethical opportunities and constraints that I've mentioned earlier. But also at the other end of the spectrum, university ethics boards across Canada were quite systematically rejecting any kind of applications for research with Syrian refugees, because they were worried that this was a highly, quote unquote, vulnerable population, and that they were wary of risk. So I'll get back to this in a moment, but ethics boards actually are often set up to protect the institution and also protect the individuals, but there really also is a concern around institutional liability for ethics. So in this context, the idea was to develop guidelines. And again, this is where we were inspired by Indigenous work with Indigenous research. So in Canada, we have a tri-council guidelines which are applied to any project that is funded through any of the 3 research councils. So this ranges from social sciences up into medical science. And in this context, there was a concern that research with Indigenous populations posed particular opportunities and challenges. And in a similar way, we tried to develop something for research with migration in migration context to try to mirror these concerns and to try to develop guidelines that could guide researchers, but also ethics boards in trying to determine whether or not to allow research to continue. This was published in Refuge, Canada's Journal on Refugees, in both French and English. But our non-academic partners wanted something that was a little bit more of a checklist, something that was more easy to use. So we developed that also in French and English. And we also developed a group of documents that was specifically oriented towards refugees themselves, or people who would be asked to participate in research. Because one of the concerns was that they, as we mentioned before, they may not understand consent forms, they may not culturally be aware of these kinds of issues. And so we tried to come up with very plain language documents in Arabic, because this was the language that many of the Syrian refugees spoke, French and English, and we're in the process of translating this document into other languages. If you're interested in any of these documents, some of which are admittedly a little bit Canadian specific, if you Google the Canadian Council for Refugees, you'll find their website. I'm also happy to share these slides, and all of these documents are listed on their website. So this is just one example, and it's an imperfect example, which I'll get to in a moment. Another example is the ISFM Code of Ethics. So as Ulrike mentioned, I'm involved in the International Association for the Study of Forced Migration. And there was a concern shortly after the Canadian guidelines were developed for the fact that even while in some countries like Canada, we have institutional research ethics boards. In many countries, from what I understand in Germany, for example, it's not mandatory to go through these ethics boards, but also even in the Canadian context, not all subject matters are can be put before a research ethic board. So generally speaking, it's only research with human subjects that go before these boards, not other kinds of research. And so there was a concern that there was the institutional accountability was not necessarily there across the board, but there was also these increased risks, especially in the context of racist and xenophobic discourses across many different contexts. And so we developed these code of ethics, which actually are based more around principles. So I want to just highlight some of these principles before getting to the next section. So the first principle is autonomy. So this is the notion that, and again, I've reproduced, I'm not sure if you can see them all here, but I've tried to reproduce some of the language around the code because I do think it's quite progressive and it provides some opening for future research. So the idea that we will respect and promote the right of people in situations of forced migration to make their own decision about their lives, their participation in research projects, and the way they are represented in findings. Another issue here, which was very important to highlight, is that we recognize that those of us who don't have experiences of forced migration, including myself, are often invited as keynotes or other sort of expert kind of roles, when in fact we have very limited information about what it actually feels like. And so we need to try to balance this role of being an advocate and an ally with also recognizing that the people in situations of forced migration need to have autonomy over their own research decisions. Equity. So this is another principle where we commit ourselves to actively challenging repressive social structures. So I think that this is actually quite bold language to say that research is not just about taking into account these unequal power relations in the process of doing our research. It's also about trying to actually challenge these within the context in which we're working. Diversity. So again, the idea that forced migration is often reduced to a single story or a single phenomenon or a statistic, which tries to encapsulates a very complex situation. And so the idea here is to try to include a multitude of perspectives and proactively seek to include those who are marginalized or excluded from decision-making and research processes. And finally, competence. So the recognizing that our methodologies have to be culturally appropriate, but also adapted to forced migration contexts, and that we as researchers have a responsibility to ensure that people are aware of these ethical issues and also provide adequate training for those people with whom we work, including interpreters, gatekeepers, students, for example. So in Canada, for example, we have a strong push towards so-called experiential learning, where students actually go out into community organizations and learn as part of their education. I actually think it's a fantastic way of learning. However, there are ethical issues here, and I think that you need to really train students and make them aware before sending them into these kind of contexts. And finally, partnership. Here, I think what's really interesting is a lot of the discussion that emerged on this issue came actually around money. So many of our so-called partners in community organizations were quite angry actually with researchers who don't include them in research budgets, who don't include them in major decisions that are made about the research project, and really use them mostly as a kind of data collection kind of tool in a very instrumental way. So if we really want true partnership, there needs to be more of an effort to include them in all of these aspects. But also on the flip side, there needs to be a reciprocity where researchers are actually going to contribute their time and talents to the partner initiatives that are not related to the research. So if your community partner wants you to come in and help serve food or translate a document or do these kinds of things, we as researchers should be open to that, because partnership is really about trying to establish this kind of long-term relationship. So I know I'm running out of time, so I want to quickly touch on a few future directions. And again, I'm giving this a question mark because I think this raises more kind of questions rather than answers, and I hope will lead into this discussion period. So the first kind of area which I think we need to have more discussion around is this tension between procedural and relational ethics. So to date, including in research ethics boards, but even admittedly the Canadian guidelines, there's been a focus really on procedural ethics. So in other words, this idea that we need to have checklists, we need to have prescriptive sort of solutions to these ethical problems. And on the other hand, the reality that research is messy, that the ethical dilemmas that are posed once we actually start doing research are sometimes irresolvable, or at least could be resolved in multiple ways. The other thing too is that there's this sort of false sense of security in having research ethics board approval. So some researchers sort of feel like because they have this paper with a certification that their research project is ethical, somehow everything they do in the project will inherently be ethical. And we all know that this is not necessarily the case. And as I already mentioned too, one of the dangers of procedural ethics is by institutionalizing the ethics process. There also is a tendency to be more conservative within these research ethics boards, because they're also about preserving the institutional liability and protecting the institution from actually lawsuits and other kinds of things. And so the problem is that there is, and again, I don't think that I'm not necessarily trying to say that that there shouldn't be this element to it. What I'm trying to say is that procedural ethics cannot be the be-all and end-all. That we need to also complement this with a more broad-brushed idea of what are relational ethics. So I think one of the ways in which we can do this is more ongoing self-reflection and advocacy. And so if we go back to the examples, in the Canadian guidelines, we call them guidelines in short, but actually the title is ethical considerations, because people did want to try to think of this as a more ongoing conversation and not as this sort of prescriptive checklist. In the ISFM code, it's even more clear that we're talking about relational ethics, because there's a reference to critical reflections. So the idea here is that we need to have an ongoing, iterative kind of discussion about what is ethical, who are we in the research process, how can we change in an advocacy kind of way the way we do research, but also the way we present research. And finally, we have to recognize that ethics are socially constructed, and that the ethical guidelines are situated within power relations in this production of knowledge. And that I need to acknowledge that most of the people who worked on the guidelines, both in the Canadian context, but also in the international context, came from privileged positions. Although we tried to consult widely with community partners, although we did include people in situations of forced migration in the development of the guidelines, ultimately the people who held the pen, the people who decided on the language, really were people based mostly in the global north, but mostly white, mostly people who had no direct experience with forced migration, including myself. So I think that we need to have a much more honest discussion around representation and representativity in forced migration studies. I feel like as a field, we are behind in this kind of honest reflection and discussion. As Ulrike mentioned before, I also work in development studies context, and I feel at the development level, at least on paper, there is more discussion about participation and ownership. And I think that we need to start opening up these questions. And so I would like to close or end with something which refugee advocates in Canada often say in these kinds of fora. They'll say things like, this is a conference about refugees, but how many of your keynote speakers actually have a history of forced migration? And so this is really the call to challenge us to think very seriously about this notion of nothing about us without us. So I'll close there, and I look forward to receiving the questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your interesting and inspiring keynote. We have Christiane Fröhlich has collected a number of questions already that were raised in the meantime in the course of your keynote, and I would like to start by merging two questions. Again, thank you very much. You carried out research with displaced people, you mentioned, you critically reflected it, that many people, also myself, don't have a background in forced migration, don't have personal experiences. From your experience, from your position as a researcher, what would you think are the single most important ethical aspects that, that should be improved? Perhaps drawing on the last pieces of criticism. And I would like to combine that with a question that was raised by the participants. What is the role of financial support given to refugees in exchange for information? Is the monetary aspect discussed differently than in other ethnographic exchange situation, for example, as sort of humanitarian act or giving back, or what I know, reciprocity?
Great, thank you very much. I mean, those are big questions, and I think that, you know, different people will have different answers to them. For my own perspective, so sort of what is one of the most singly important, I think this issue of positionality and recognizing the power structures within which we operate, both in the research field, but also more broadly within society. And I think on the one hand, and this kind of links to the second question about compensation. On the one hand, I think that those of us who do have positions of privilege, relatively speaking, can use those positions as to be advocates and to get access to people and places that perhaps those in situations of forced migration cannot have access to. But I think at the same time, simultaneously, we also need to be trying to widen that access. So there are some really great initiatives like Share the Platform, for example, from Anita Fabos and other colleagues, who basically are saying every time they're invited to present, they're also asked if they can bring or also co-present with, for example, a refugee colleague or someone who has more direct experience with it. So I think that these are ways in which we can start rethinking this sort of spokesperson aspect and try to think more carefully about some of these power relations. On the compensation issue, I mean, this is a huge debate. I don't think it is specific to forced migration studies. However, I do think that we have to take into account the specific context in which we're working, and this is where compensation probably will vary depending on those contexts. I do think that there is an element here of sort of sharing the wealth, if you will. So we're often very well compensated for the work that we do. We're also often have large research budgets, and I think we need to think about the ways in which we can give back. Now, whether that's individual compensation for people, and often the sort of baseline within development studies, at least, is to try to think, okay, what did people have to give up? What was the opportunity cost to participate in the research? So if they had to leave their work for a couple of hours, or if they had to find childcare for their children, or if they had to take public transportation to get, obviously those costs should be compensated, not as compensation for their time per se, but compensation for actually monetary losses that they incurred by participating in the research. At a different level, I think when we think about the ethical principles of cost versus benefits, that's where I think we can think about ways in which the research should benefit the community writ large. So are there ways in which, through the findings of the research on an advocacy level or at a kind of more project level, could there be investments made in particular programs or initiatives that come from the refugee community or the forced migration community with whom we're working that could then be a true sort of partnership where they're benefiting monetarily from the research that's being done within their communities?
Perfect, thank you so much. I just looked at the time, and sadly, it's running much faster than I would have hoped. And I apologize in advance, but I would like to combine two questions again. I hope that's okay for you. These are two questions from the audience again. As a non-Indigenous researcher, what do you think is particularly important for studies in Indigenous population? And you also said that we should consider the privacy of the research participants and the impact of research findings, for example, their legal status. So the question that was raised is, shall we not tell everything we know from the research participants, or what about the contribution to the field study? Noting thank you particularly. And then another question is for us, another interesting question in ethnographic research is how to find the balance between being sensitive on the one hand to power and inequality structures between researchers and participants, and othering on the other hand. And how is it to shape the leaving of the research field by not just telling things to the data and leaving the participants in precarious situations? Thank you.
Great. I will do my best to answer those very important questions. So the first is on the Indigenous methodology. So I am not Indigenous, and I don't work with Indigenous populations in Canada. However, coming out of the report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, one of the recommendations is an attempt to rethink pedagogy within universities and try to indigenize to a certain degree the pedagogies. And so because I teach research methods, what I have tried to do is to think more carefully and deliberately about what can we learn from different ways of knowing and different ways of being, including Indigenous ways of thinking and gathering information, which really focuses a lot on community relationships as opposed to individuals, for example. Also a spiritual connection to the land, for example. So these are the ways in which we've tried to think through some of the Indigenous, and I say we because I don't actually feel very qualified as a white settler who has not studied Indigenous issues to do this sensitively. And so often I reach out to Indigenous colleagues and or colleagues who have a long history of working with Indigenous communities to think about ways in which we can do this. And so, for example, in the Canadian Both documents actually reference Indigenous methodologies, and we have tried, for example, this notion of reciprocity is very much based on Indigenous ways of doing and being. I might need to be reminded of the second question. Sorry, I should have brought a pen and paper.
Absolutely fine. The second question was about leaving the context. So shall we not tell everything we know from the data? Yeah. And what about contributing to the field, as well as the othering versus sensitivity to power? Yeah.
Right. Yeah, thank you. So, I mean, I think that this is a huge debate, and I would actually, this is the disadvantage of doing this virtually, because I would love to have a kind of coffee with the person who asked this question. I think that, so the challenge here is, let me just collect my thoughts. Maybe if I can actually address the power one first, because I feel like it, so we don't want to exoticize other people, but we also need to be sensitive to the context. And so I think here really one of the ways in which we can do this is through reflexivity, to rethink really what is our position in the research and what is our responsibility within that research context, both to the localized power relations, but also to the ways in which those localized power relations feed into the globalized power relations. And so I'm not suggesting that, we quote unquote go native. What I'm suggesting here is that we think very carefully about who we are and how our position within a research context changes that research context. And so we really do need to think more carefully around that. The second question, if I can come back to that, is the tension between sort of methodology and ethics, if I can put it as bluntly as that. So on the one hand, we do as scholars have an ethical obligation to disclose all data. We're not supposed to be repressing data. We're not supposed to be not disclosing information that doesn't support our argument. So there's a tension between that and contributions to the field and contributions to knowledge, and also sensitivities to not jeopardizing people's individual and collective safety and status. And so what I'm suggesting here is that we need to think about the ways in which how we disclose information is going to impact on people's lives. I also think too that when we're in situations where there's a possibility that people might disclose, for example, illegal behavior. So we as human beings, but also as researchers often have, and sometimes also professionals like social workers may have an ethical obligation to disclose information if someone could be at harm, for example, or if someone is engaging in activities that are against the law. And so if we're working in that context, we have to make it very explicit so that, again, getting back to the context of autonomy, the individual can make their own decision about whether or not they're going to disclose that information, right? So, if people know from the very beginning that if you tell me that you're engaged in trafficking, I have to report that to the Canadian government. They'll then make their own personal decision about whether or not they want to disclose and the degree to which they want to disclose. But I do think this is a huge issue that our field hasn't grappled with well enough. And I think that there is a tendency towards trying to uphold this academic principle of sort of having a very comprehensive set of data, and less towards thinking about what are the ethical implications of exposing all this information.
Perfect, thank you so much. I'm going straight to the next question, including part of a comment from the audience. Much discussion in Germany revolves around the link between research and politics or activism, often claiming that research should contribute to better protection or improve political decision-making. What's your take on it? And can this pose ethical issues? And if yes, which ones? In particular, and this is perhaps if I can add that, particular as refugee research is a normal discipline or field of study, which with the need and pressure to publish, qualify, get funding, build a career, how does that relate to ethical principles, which is pretty much rethinking or thinking through the entire academic system for you now, Christina. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I'll probably get tongue-tied like the last time. I think that, so if I get, the issue of trying to establish ourselves as a discipline is an interesting one. I mean, migration studies is inherently interdisciplinary. So I think at the best we can hope for is becoming an established field, like development studies, for example. However, I do think that one of the advantages of doing something differently is to be able to challenge the system. So I do think that it is problematic the way that this system, if you will, is based on professionalization of let's have an academic association, let's have funding developed to this, let's have particular programs, etc. And I think that we need to think about like what are we contributing to in the broad project? What is our end goal? And this is, I think, a really interesting time for forced migration studies because, as we've mentioned, there's a lot of policy interest in it. There's a lot of media interest in it. And I think that this is an opportunity for us to think, okay, what do we want to not be sort of swayed or pushed by these external forces, but to actually think very seriously about methodology. And this is why I'm very excited that you've started off this conference by thinking about methodology, because I think it's often thought of more in an instrumental way, like as a tool to achieve certain goals. But if we think about other disciplines like sociology, there was a particular methodological tradition that was built around that particular discipline. So if we want to be taken seriously as a field, I think we also need to seriously think about these methodological issues and our role in the sort of production of knowledge. I'm not sure if I answered fully the question.
To be quite frank, there is so little time with so broad questions. I'm not sure if one can ever answer all of the question entirely, and it may actually take a cup of coffee to sit down and reflect them. But thank you very much. Yes, I believe your response very much shed light on the questions. Would you like to add anything? Otherwise, I would come already with the next question.
I think that's it. Go ahead with the next question.
Perfect. Okay, since we have now the last 5 minutes started, I would like to add two more fields of question for you, which also came from the audience. The first is about gatekeepers. Do you have suggestions how to handle the power imbalance concerning gatekeeping services or service providers and data dissemination? That's the first field. The second field is you have mentioned highly visible and easily accessible groups which are therefore over-researched, alluding to common selection biases in forced migration and refugee research. What would you need, what would need to happen to solve this problem in terms of education of refugee and forced migration researchers, but also in terms of research practices and ethical and security considerations? Which are the groups that you would like to see more researched? Perhaps also which areas and questions are, in your opinion, still too little considered in the previous years and research? Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. So on the gatekeepers question, I mean, I do think that this is one of the challenges of our field, is because we're working with populations who often are controlled in one way or another, and or who are being given services through particular organizations. It's very difficult to have access without going through these organizations. And I think that this severely compromises our ability to do independent research. And so I think that the only thing that we can do is to keep pushing for continued access to these spaces, and also to try to negotiate access that is as wide as possible. However, I mean, any of us who have worked in a refugee camp know that that is very difficult, that, you know, you're relying on UN agencies, government, NGOs to provide you with the access to the populations. And those populations also know that you have been given access via these organizations, and so therefore are concerned about disclosing information that might be critical of these organizations. So this is one issue where I think that you know, we have to just continue to try to push for greater access and greater independence. So the second question is sort of the sampling question and question around under-researched topics. So I do think that there is a bit of a sampling bias. I mean, I don't think it's a sampling bias in a sort of quantitative sense of the word. I think it's more in the sense that, well, I mean, there is a sampling bias quantitatively where researchers don't do proper sampling and will just do convenience sampling. So they basically just, you know, research anyone who happens to be available. But generally speaking, serious quantitative researchers will do proper you know, random sampling within a population. What I do think, though, is more the issue is that, you know, because of time constraints, because of resource constraints, because of political constraints, because of funding constraints, we'll generally try to gravitate towards topics that are more obvious, if you will. And I think this is where, again, it's helpful to go back to the data, the UNHCR data, which again is imperfect, but at least gives us a snapshot. And to say, okay, so where are the missing people here? Like, you know, when you look at the list of the countries of origin or the nationalities of refugees, why are we not hearing so much about Sudanese refugees, for example? And part of this also relates back to the question that I didn't really properly answer in the previous round, which is on the policy making. So one of the difficulties or challenges we have is, on the one hand, we want to influence policy. So that means that we also have to work on things that are somewhat relevant or on the radar of the government. On the other hand, this means that we then tend to reinforce this sort of focus on particular groups and particular issues. And so I think that we need to try to complement some of that tendency to try to be looking really at the policy relevant, with also trying to say, okay, where are ways in which that we haven't really been able to influence policy? And one of the topics I would say is probably, I mean, a lot of people are working on sort of so-called climate migration, but I would say that a lot of governments are not that interested, and Christiane is one of them, but a lot of governments are not actually that interested in trying to develop a policy on this because it's a can of worms. We also see in the Global Compact on Refugees, for example, there is no mention of environmental migration. So I think this is one area where we can try to push for a greater research and also greater policy that's actually evidence-based, and where we can actually push our governments to try to be more expansive.
Thank you so much. I would say, in German, I would say that's a Punktlandung, which basically means you're right on time. Thank you so much for your keynote, for all the presentation, for all the responses to the questions. Christiane, thank you so much for collecting, putting together the questions on the other side. I think that worked perfectly. I hope I presented the question in an understandable way, but thank you so, so much. Thank you also very much to the audience for raising so many very interesting questions. We're extremely sorry for not being able to pose all questions that you raised, but that's, as always, never enough time. But thank you so much. I'm sure that if questions remain, people can get in touch with you and initiate further discussion. Again, thank you so much. I look forward to the continued debates during the conference and, of course, contact with you, Christina. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, everyone.